Before the thunder of war, there was silence. Across America, factories slept, their machines cold, their halls echoing with the hum of peace. Men worked simple shifts. Women stayed home, their hands busy with families, not with steel. The skies were calm, the airfields quiet, and the word bomber felt distant, a thing of another world's nightmares. But somewhere across the ocean, fires were already lit. In Europe, engines roared under swastikas. Armies marched, and the world began to tremble. America watched, uncertain, unwilling to believe that the storm could reach its shores. Yet in those silent factories, Ford, Boeing, Douglas, Lockheed, the machines waited. Idle presses, empty hangars, steel and tools ready for a purpose not yet spoken. It was a calm so deep it almost felt eternal. But history was holding its breath. Soon, the world would demand the impossible, and those same quiet factories would become the beating heart of the greatest industrial miracle the world had ever seen. The silence was only the beginning.
When the call finally came, it echoed across every town, every farm, every city street in America. Men lined up, young, strong, untested, ready to cross oceans for a world on fire. Factories emptied overnight. The hands that once built cars and tractors now gripped rifles and machine guns. Fathers kissed their children goodbye. Sons became soldiers before they became men. The nation shifted in a single heartbeat, from the calm of peace to the thunder of war. Train stations filled with uniforms and tears. Convoys rumbled east and west, carrying dreams toward uncertainty. The world was burning, and America, finally, had stepped into the flames. But behind them, as ships left the docks and columns marched toward destiny, a new battlefront appeared, one not fought with bullets, but with bolts, steel, and sweat. Because while the men marched to war, someone had to build the weapons they would fight with. And soon, the world would see who would rise to take their place.
The sound of industry faded. The clatter of tools, the whir of belts, the laughter between shifts, gone. America's great factories, once alive with motion, now stood still. Assembly lines stretched into silence, their stations waiting for hands that would never return. The men who built engines now fought in tanks. The welders who shaped wings now crouched in foxholes. And in the stillness of those vast steel halls, dust began to gather on machines meant to build the future. It was a strange kind of emptiness, not death, but pause, a waiting, as if the nation itself was holding its breath, unsure of what came next. The war demanded weapons, but who would build them when the builders were gone? In the shadows of those quiet hangars, a new force was about to rise, unexpected, underestimated, and unstoppable. The empty assembly lines would not stay empty for long.
When the factories fell silent, Washington sent out a different kind of call. Not for soldiers, but for builders. Posters went up overnight. Your country needs you at home. The message was clear. The war couldn't be won by those on the front lines alone. America needed hands, millions of them, to weld, to rivet, to assemble, to forge. Every bolt and bullet became as vital as every rifle and tank. Trains began carrying not troops, but workers, housewives, teachers, secretaries, farmers' daughters, women who had never seen an engine but were now asked to build one strong enough to cross the Atlantic. The Homefront was no longer a place of safety. It was a battlefield of production, measured not in casualties, but in output. And as telegrams arrived with news of lost sons and husbands, the nation's women stood up, rolled up their sleeves, and answered the call. The war had come home, and America's factories would never be the same again.
They came by the thousands. From small towns and big cities, from farms and schools and kitchens, women who had never worn uniforms, now dressed in overalls and steel-toed boots. They filled the trains before dawn, lunch pails in hand, their hearts heavy with worry, but burning with purpose. For every man who went to war, a woman stepped forward to replace him. They learned to read blueprints, handle torches, rivet wings, and lift steel heavier than anything they'd ever known. The newspapers called them girls. History would call them heroes. There were no parades for these recruits, no marching bands, no medals, only the hiss of welding sparks, the rumble of factory floors, and the pride of knowing every turn of a wrench brought their loved ones one step closer to coming home. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and they had become soldiers of industry. The nation had cried for help, and the women of America had answered.
At first, she was just an image, a strong woman with a red bandana, sleeves rolled up, and 5 simple words that captured a nation's spirit. We can do it. But Rosie the Riveter was never just ink on paper. She was the heartbeat of a revolution. She stood for every woman who traded aprons for uniforms, who swapped sewing needles for rivet guns, who wiped sweat from her brow instead of tears. Rosie became a symbol of what no one thought possible, that women could build planes, tanks, and ships with the same precision, power, and pride as any man. She wasn't born from fantasy. She was born from factory floors, from the real Rosies who worked 12-hour shifts, who lost loved ones overseas, but never stopped showing up to keep the assembly lines alive. Rosie the Riveter reminded America that strength had no gender, and courage wore many faces. She wasn't propaganda. She was prophecy, the proof that the war for freedom was being fought not just abroad, but right here at home.
The moment the first women stepped onto the factory floor, America's heart began to beat with a new rhythm. Steel replaced silence. The empty assembly lines roared back to life, and those vast industrial halls, once quiet and uncertain, became fortresses of production. The walls shook with the sound of progress, presses pounding, welders sparking, engines roaring to life. Every bolt tightened, every panel fastened was another blow struck against tyranny. Posters hung above the workstations read, "The more we build, the sooner they'll come home." And they meant it. Boeing built bombers, Ford built tanks, Douglas built wings that would darken enemy skies. But beyond the steel and sweat, something deeper was forged: unity. For the first time, men and women, side by side, were fighting the same war from different fronts. The factories became America's fortresses, not of stone and gunfire, but of will, endurance, and determination. The enemy had their armies. America had its workers. And soon, those workers would build enough power to change the course of the war itself.
They came with no experience. Secretaries,
farmers' wives, students, nurses, and stood before machines that looked more like monsters than tools. The first days were chaos. Sparks flew in every direction. Hands blistered, bolts jammed. Engines refused to fit, and metal refused to bend. But quitting was never an option. Instructors barked over the roar of drills. Hold steady, measure twice, keep your line clean. And slowly, the chaos began to turn into rhythm. Each clang of steel became a lesson learned. Each mistake, a step toward mastery. They learned to read blueprints like maps to victory, to weld seams so tight that no bullet could pierce them. They learned the weight of responsibility, that every rivet might mean a life saved thousands of miles away. Soon those once clumsy hands moved with precision and pride. The women who once doubted themselves now built machines of war with confidence. The tools of war were not just in their hands, they were in their hearts. Because they weren't just building bombers, they were building belief that they could do anything.
The factories never slept. Day blurred into night, and night into day, as the war demanded more and more and more. Women stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the glare of furnace light, faces streaked with grease and exhaustion, hands calloused, backs aching, yet never stopping. Every bomber wing, every engine block, every crate of ammunition came with a price. Missed meals, sleepless nights, letters unread, children kissed goodbye before dawn. They worked through sickness, through grief, through rationing and fear. The air smelled of oil and metal. The ground shook with the weight of production. They weren't just workers. They were warriors in denim and steel. Each rivet was a promise to their sons, to their husbands, to every soldier they would never meet. The sweat on their brows mixed with the steel they forged, binding sacrifice into every machine that left the line. And though few would ever know their names, the bombers they built carried their spirit across the world, a silent army of courage, flying on wings made by sacrifice.
At last, the doors of the factory opened, and out of the smoke and noise came giants. Freshly riveted, gleaming in silver and gray, the first American bombers rolled into the sunlight. Engines thundered for the first time, echoing through the air like the heartbeat of a new America. Every vibration carried the effort of thousands, the welders, the riveters, the inspectors, the women who had given everything to bring these flying fortresses to life. Crowds gathered along the runways. Workers wiped their hands, their faces lit with pride and disbelief. They had built something powerful, something unstoppable, machines that would soon soar beyond the horizon to challenge empires. When the first bomber lifted from the ground, cheers erupted across the factory floor. It wasn't just metal taking flight, it was proof. Proof that ordinary people with courage and conviction could build the extraordinary. The world would soon see them in the skies above Europe and the Pacific. But for now, on that runway, the miracle of American industry had just taken off.
Not everyone believed it could last. Some men scoffed at the idea that women could handle machines, meet quotas, or build aircraft meant for war. In break rooms and boardrooms, the whispers spread. They're too slow. They'll quit when it gets hard. They can't do what men do. But every spark that flew from a welder's torch
was an answer to that doubt. Every finished wing, every perfect rivet, was quiet defiance against disbelief. The women knew what was said about them, and they didn't argue. They worked. Shift after shift, they proved themselves not with words, but with results. The bombers rolled out faster, the quality climbed higher, and the skeptics fell silent. The stubbornness that once doubted them became the same stubbornness that drove them. They didn't just meet expectations, they shattered them. And by the time the next inspection came, even the old foreman admitted it. These girls build them better than we ever did. The war had a new secret weapon, not made of steel, but of determination.
Across America's heartland, behind barbed wire and guarded fences, German prisoners of war watched a world they never imagined. They had been soldiers of the Reich, men who once marched under banners of conquest, who believed in their empire's strength and in the myths of their superiority. Now they worked the fields, built roads, and waited for a war they had already lost to catch up with them. But one day, the guards brought them somewhere different, to the factories, the places where America's war machines were born. They expected to see lines of hardened men, sweat and soot, muscle and might. Instead, they saw something that froze them in disbelief. Women. Hundreds of them, building bombers, welding steel, operating massive machinery with calm precision. The same aircraft that had turned German skies into firestorms were being built by women, efficient, fearless, unrelenting. Behind the fences, the prisoners stared in silence. Some laughed nervously, others shook their heads, unable to understand. The propaganda they had been fed, that America was weak, soft, and broken, crumbled before their eyes, because there, in the roar of those factories, they saw the real power of the United States, not in its soldiers, but in its spirit.
Under the watch of armed guards, German POWs were quietly put to work, not on the front lines, but beside the humming factories that fueled the war. They stacked crates, hauled metal, unloaded shipments of rivets and steel, never far from the thunder of production. Each day, they watched bombers grow piece by piece, their wings stretching toward the sky like the shadow of inevitability. At first, they muttered under their breath, mocking, sneering, pretending not to be impressed. They were soldiers of a superior nation after all. But the more they watched, the quieter they became. They saw women handling machines they themselves would have feared to touch. They saw cooperation, precision, a calm efficiency that no propaganda could explain away. At lunch breaks, they caught glimpses of laughter, women sharing sandwiches and stories amid the roar of engines. There was pride in their faces, not fear. It was work, not war. But to the POWs, it looked like power, a kind of strength their own country had never allowed. Every day, they labored beside those lines. Something inside them shifted. Because no matter what they had been told about America, they now saw the truth with their own eyes. The true arsenal of democracy was not made of men or machines, but of unity.
It began like any other morning. The whistle blew, the factory floor rumbled awake, and the air filled with the rhythm of hammers and drills. But then, the doors opened, and a group of unfamiliar faces stepped inside, escorted by armed guards. German prisoners. They walked in silence, their gray uniforms in sharp contrast to the bright overalls of the workers. Eyes darted around the factory, up at the towering bombers, down at the assembly lines humming with motion. At first, the women paused. The sound of tools slowed,
the air thick with unease. They had lost brothers and husbands to this war, and now the enemy stood just a few feet away. The guards gave their orders. The POWs were there to assist, to move parts, carry supplies, to labor under the same roof as those they once fought against. Some of the women refused to even look at them. Others met their eyes, cold, unflinching. But as hours passed, something unexpected happened. The prisoners worked quietly, efficiently, and for the first time, they saw the full machine of American industry, a place where women commanded the war effort with skill and pride. When the guards brought them in, those prisoners thought they would see weakness. Instead, they saw power, a power unlike anything their world had ever allowed.
The day the German prisoners were led through the main assembly hangar, the air was already trembling with sound, rivets snapping, engines rumbling, and the echo of hundreds of hammers striking steel. They expected chaos. Instead, they saw perfection. Row after row of women, focused, fierce, tireless, building the bombers that had once darkened their skies. The massive B-17s stretched from one end of the hangar to the other, their polished frames glinting under the harsh lights. Wings the size of buildings, engines like thunder waiting to be unleashed. The POWs stopped walking. They couldn't look away. These weren't soldiers. These weren't men hardened by battle. These were women, mothers, daughters, young wives, commanding machines, climbing ladders, drilling rivets with precision that stunned even the guards. One prisoner whispered, "Frauen, they build these?" Another muttered, "No wonder we're losing." For the first time, the arrogance of their propaganda shattered. The Reich had promised that women belonged only in the home. But here, in this roaring cathedral of steel and fire, they saw a different truth. A nation where everyone fought, everyone built, everyone mattered. The shock that filled that hangar that day wasn't just disbelief, it was revelation. The hangars glowed with blue fire. Sparks rained like stars, illuminating faces streaked with sweat and determination. Women bent over steel frames, their torches cutting through metal like lightning, joining pieces that would soon carry men into the heart of battle. They welded in shifts that stretched deep into the night, their arms trembling from hours of heat and vibration. But every seam sealed was a small victory, another step toward the skies. The noise was deafening, yet there was rhythm in the chaos, the steady pulse of a nation's will made visible in light and flame. The Germans who watched could hardly believe it. In their world, women had been told to stay silent, obedient, small. But here, they wielded fire. They forged wings. They commanded the birth of bombers that would soon thunder over Europe. Each spark that flew from a welder's torch was more than metal meeting metal. It was history being rewritten. Because in those hangars, beneath the roar of engines and the hum of power, the women of America were proving a truth the enemy had never imagined possible. That strength had no gender, and freedom could be built by anyone brave enough to pick up a torch.
By 1943, America's factories no longer looked like places of work. They looked like fortresses. The walls trembled with the rhythm of production. Steel roared, pistons screamed. From dawn until well past midnight, every machine, every hand, every spark was part of a massive, living organism, the arsenal of democracy. Inside the vast hangars, women and men moved with military precision. Airframes rolled down lines the length of city blocks. Engines thundered to life before the paint had even dried. Each B-17 or B-24 bomber that emerged from the shadows was more than a machine. It was a declaration. Armed guards stood at the gates. Posters warned, "Loose lips sink ships." The blueprints were secrets, guarded tighter than gold. Even the cafeteria talk was coded. Workers spoke in whispers about birds and cargo, never bombers or payloads. To the prisoners of war who saw them, these factories were unlike anything in Europe. There was no fear, no defeat in the air, only resolve, the quiet confidence of a people who had turned every hammer, every wrench, every heart into a weapon of freedom. The assembly lines became battlefields of their own. Every rivet, every weld, every test flight was a strike against tyranny. And when the bombers took to the sky, their shadows carried the power of millions who had never set foot on the front lines but fought just as fiercely from behind them.
Letters from the front often carried astonishment alongside admiration. Soldiers wrote home in disbelief at what they were seeing. Women working in factories, entire towns mobilized, and machines of war being produced at a staggering pace. "You wouldn't believe it," one soldier wrote. "The Americans have women building bombers, and they do it better than anyone imagined. It's incredible. I am proud, and yet I can hardly believe it." The mixture of pride and disbelief reflected a larger truth. The war effort had transformed society in ways no one had predicted. Skills, roles, and expectations shifted almost overnight, and the contributions of ordinary people became extraordinary. Across letters, journals, and conversations, the sentiment was unanimous. Admiration for the tireless workers who refused to yield, and awe at the speed, skill, and scale of their accomplishments. Pride and disbelief intertwined, capturing the wonder of a nation rising to meet a challenge unlike any other.
By 1942, the war was no longer just fought overseas. Across the United States, a new army of workers took up the tools of industry. And for the first time, many of them were women. They were mothers, sisters, daughters, and suddenly they were building the very machines that would take men into the skies. Dearest, you wouldn't believe it. The Americans have women building bombers. They're working the machines, welding the wings, riveting the fuselages. I can't imagine a more extraordinary sight. It gives me hope. Letters like these carried more than news. They carried wonder, pride, and the unmistakable sense that the world was changing. For many soldiers, it was the first time they realized that women too were at the heart of the war effort. We weren't just filling in for men. We were building the planes that would fight the war. Every bolt, every rivet, every engine was our contribution. And somehow, we knew it mattered. The women of America were no longer just keeping the home fires burning. They were forging the weapons of victory.
In the heart of America's industrial cities, the factories had become more than workplaces. They were arsenals of freedom. Every hammer, every press, every welding torch was part of a single, enormous effort to arm a nation and win a global war. Inside these sprawling plants, the rhythm of production was relentless. Men and women worked side by side, often around the clock, driven by the knowledge that every plane, every tank, every shell could tip the scales of battle. There was pride in the precision. There was purpose in the sweat. and there was an unspoken understanding that these walls, these machines, and these people formed the backbone of the Allied effort. "When I walk through these halls, I feel the pulse of something greater than myself," one worker would later write. "We are not just making machines, we are making history." The spirit of the arsenal was more than metal and machinery. It was discipline, dedication, and a quiet determination to do whatever it took. From the pounding of hammers to the roar of engines, the factories became the beating heart of a nation at war.
War demanded more than courage. It demanded innovation. And in the factories of America, machines became both instruments of mercy and agents of destruction. Bombers and tanks rolled off assembly lines, each built with precision and care, ready to strike at the enemy. But alongside them, ambulances, medical supplies, and mobile field hospitals were produced with the same urgency, carrying hope and relief to the wounded. "We were building machines to fight," one engineer recalled, "and machines to save. In every bolt there was a choice: power or protection, destruction or deliverance." In this dual purpose, the factories embodied the complexity of modern war. Steel and fire forged weapons of might, while skill and ingenuity crafted tools of mercy. Every plane that soared into the sky, every vehicle that rumbled across foreign soil, carried the hands, hearts, and minds of those who built them. The machines of America were more than cold metal. They were a testament to a nation's resolve, its compassion, and its unyielding determination to see the war through to the end. On distant battlefields and in shadowed hangars, two great powers tested one another, not just with weapons, but with ingenuity, skill, and sheer determination. What began as competition soon became a rivalry forged in mutual respect. Engineers studied enemy designs with awe. Pilots marveled at the daring maneuvers of their counterparts. Even amidst the violence of war, there was recognition, an unspoken understanding that excellence on either side demanded courage, intelligence, and relentless effort. "We fought each other, yes," a soldier later wrote, "but we also learned from each other. Every challenge pushed us to be better, to innovate, to endure." In workshops and factories, the lessons of the front were mirrored in every bolt and rivet. Teams raced against time, knowing that the machines they built could match or surpass anything the enemy could create. It was a rivalry tempered by admiration, a fierce contest of minds and machines that drove both sides to heights neither could reach alone. In the crucible of war, respect became its own kind of weapon, shaping strategies, technologies, and the very spirit of those who fought.
The factories never truly slept. Day after day, shift after shift, men and women toiled under the harsh glare of overhead lights, their hands stained with oil and sweat. The hum of machinery was constant, a relentless heartbeat of production that stretched into the night. Many workers arrived before dawn, and many left long after the stars had risen. Each moment was filled with purpose, yet exhaustion was inevitable. Still, there was a quiet pride in knowing that every bolt tightened, every fuselage assembled, brought the war closer to an end. And when the shifts ended, the silence of the night was a stark contrast to the day's clamor. Outside, the world slept, unaware of the tireless effort within. Inside, the ghosts of work and duty lingered, a reminder that victory required more than courage on the battlefield. It required endurance in every quiet corner of the home front. Sometimes it felt endless, one worker remembered. But I knew the planes, the tanks, the ships, they carried a part of us with them. In that knowledge,
The long hours became bearable, even necessary. The endless shifts forged resilience. The silent nights forged resolve. Together, they shaped a generation, a workforce, and a nation prepared to see the world through the dark hours of war.
In the sprawling factories that had become the backbone of the war effort, a new rhythm emerged, a cadence measured not by minutes but by missions. Every hour a bomber rolled off the assembly line, ready to carry men, machines, and hope into the skies above Europe and the Pacific. Workers moved with precision, each task choreographed like a military operation. Engineers checked every instrument, welders reinforced every joint, and mechanics tested every engine until it roared to life. The factory floor became a place where time itself was compressed, and the world outside seemed to hinge on the efficiency within. We knew that each bomber meant something, a worker recalled, another chance for the men in the air, another strike at the enemy. It was exhausting work, but we also felt the weight of its purpose. From dawn to dusk, from shift to shift, the assembly lines never slowed. The sound of drills, presses, and hammers created a relentless symphony, a testament to human endurance and ingenuity. By the hour, by the day, by the sweat and skill of thousands, the arsenal of freedom grew. Each bomber was more than metal and engines. It was a symbol of resolve, a promise that the fight would continue until victory was won.
Above the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, the sky became a canvas painted with the labor of a nation. Thousands of bombers, built by tireless hands back home, soared into formation, their engines a thunderous tribute to the factories that gave them life. Each plane carried not only bombs and supplies, but the hopes, skill, and determination of the men and women who had crafted it. Pilots and crews looked upward at the expanse of machines, knowing that every rivet, every engine, every carefully aligned wing reflected countless hours of dedication. "When I saw the sky filled with them," one soldier later wrote, "I realized how many lives were behind each one. We weren't just flying into battle, we were carrying a whole country with us." The work of the home front and the courage of the front lines merged in the heavens. Factories produced the machines, workers forged the tools, and the skies bore witness to the might of their combined effort. It was a testament to human ingenuity and resolve, a reminder that even in war, the hands of ordinary people could reach extraordinary heights.
Across enemy lines, the war left its mark on men in ways the world could not always see. Prisoners of war, soldiers captured and confined, endured hardship, hunger, and uncertainty. Yet even behind barbed wire, memories of home, of comrades, and of the factories that fueled their fight lingered. Some remembered the roar of American assembly lines, the women welding wings and riveting fuselages that carried their brothers into battle. They spoke of it with awe and respect, knowing that the labor of those far from the front had made a difference they could never repay. "We never saw them on the battlefield," one former POW recalled, "but we knew they were out there, building the planes, the tanks, the engines that kept us fighting. We never forgot that. We carried their work with us, even in the darkest moments." For these men, survival was intertwined with remembrance. The names, the faces, and the tireless efforts of the Homefront became a beacon, a testament to the unity and resilience of a nation at war. In the minds of POWs, the sacrifices made beyond the front lines were never invisible. They were a silent force, shaping the war as much as any soldier in uniform, and a reminder that courage takes many forms.
They worked in the factories, in the shipyards, and along the assembly lines, not for glory, not for recognition, but because the country needed them. Mothers, daughters, and sisters became the backbone of the war effort, their hands shaping the machines that would carry soldiers in the battle. Riveting wings, welding fuselages, assembling engines, each task demanded skill, precision, and endurance. And yet, they rarely spoke of it. The work itself was its own reward. "I never thought of it as heroic," one woman later said. "I was just doing what had to be done." From the buzzing factories to the quiet moments at home, their contribution was immense. They were engineers, welders, mechanics, and operators, roles once thought impossible for women, and they excelled. Their efforts kept the war machine running. Their determination turned sweat into strength, their perseverance into power. Though history often celebrated battles and generals, it was these women who ensured victory was possible. They never asked for praise, but their legacy endures, a reminder that heroism is not always loud, and courage does not always wear a uniform.
The war changed more than the course of nations. It changed the course of lives. Women who had stepped into factories and shipyards, mastering rivets, welds, and engines, discovered a new sense of independence and capability. When the men returned from the front, many women were expected to step aside. Yet the experience had altered expectations and ambitions. The courage and skill they had shown on the home front became the foundation for a movement that would demand equality beyond the war. "We learned that we could do more than anyone had thought," one former factory worker reflected. "And once you know that, it's impossible to go back." The lessons of the assembly line, discipline, innovation, and determination transformed into the lessons of activism. The same hands that had built bombers now helped build a vision of a more just society. From rivets to rights, the legacy of these women endured. Their labor in wartime factories was not just a contribution to victory. It was the spark that ignited a struggle for recognition, opportunity, and equality that would shape generations to come.
The war ended, but its echoes remained. The factories fell silent, the assembly lines slowed, and the planes that once filled the skies returned to hangars. Yet the strength forged during those years did not fade. The men and women who had endured the endless shifts, the pressure, and the uncertainty carried with them a new understanding of what they were capable of. They had faced impossible demands, adapted, and persevered, and in doing so, they had reshaped the world around them. We learned to endure, to innovate, to fight in ways that weren't on any battlefield map, a former worker recalled. That strength stayed with us long after the war was over. The legacy of the home front was more than machines and weapons. It was resilience, courage, and determination passed from one generation to the next. It was a reminder that in the darkest hours, ordinary people could achieve extraordinary feats. In every city, every town, every quiet corner of the nation, the spirit of those who built, welded, and persevered lived on. Their story is a testament to the enduring power of human strength, unity, and resolve. A legacy that would inspire long after the guns fell silent.
Even in the midst of war, moments of shared humanity could shine through. On battlefields and in prisoner of war camps, acts of compassion reminded soldiers and civilians alike that the enemy was still human. Captured soldiers remembered the kindness of those who fed them, offered blankets, or simply treated them with dignity. Letters, small gestures, and rare encounters bridged the gap between opposing sides, revealing that courage and decency were not limited to one flag or uniform. I never expected to see kindness from the enemy, one former POW wrote, but when it came, it stayed with me far longer than any fear or hatred ever did. These moments did not erase the brutality of war, but they revealed a shared truth. Even amid conflict, empathy endured. It was a quiet reminder that the capacity for humanity exists on all sides, and that respect, compassion, and moral courage can survive even the harshest trials. When enemies saw humanity, it planted seeds of understanding that would outlast the war, shaping reconciliation, memory, and the way future generations would remember those dark years.